A Dublin childhood, 1936 to 1950. My mother was a native of Oldcastle, County Meath, but it was a place I seldom visited in my youth. It was Killary in County Meath, the birthplace of my maternal great-grandmother, and Colin in County Louth, the home of my maternal grandfather, where my siblings and I spent almost every summer holiday. My father was Dublin born and proud of it. His father and mother came from Golden near Cashel, County Tipperary. They eloped in 1898 and settled in Dublin. My grandfather joined the tram company of William Martin Murphy, the notorious Dublin employer who locked out the workers in the infamous 1913 Dublin lockout. My grandfather was one of the few inspectors who joined the subsequent strike. As a result, he lost his job and was thrown out of the company house in Dock Street, where he'd lived from the time he became an inspector. The hardship endured by my father's family because of the strike left its mark, and he was never to forget it. My father had an abiding hatred for Murphy, as did thousands of Dubliners who had suffered terrible deprivation in the lockout. He was only 12 when the Irish Volunteers and the Citizens' Army made their brave revolt against British rule in 1916. But he became one of the casualties nevertheless, when he was wounded in the lower left leg by a bullet or a piece of shrapnel. The wound had never healed properly, and it caused him pain and gave him a limp for the rest of his life. At 16, he began work selling coal door to door from a handcart. He later bought his own horse and cart and expanded his round, so that by 1932, at the age of 28, he was making a good weekly income and was able to marry my mother, who was 18 at the time. He bought his house outright for £300. However, he was something of an enigma. On one hand, capable of deep sensitivity and sympathy, while on the other, sometimes very cruel in his treatment of my mother. He became addicted to drink and would get fiercely angry when drunk, invariably taking it out on her. He would also have bouts of insane jealousy and accuse her of all kinds of infidelity. I was born in 1936, and my memory of childhood was one of constant fear as well as deprivation. There was a permanent shortage of money to buy food, clothes and other essentials. Things were in short supply generally in the war years because of rationing. Together with my father's abuse of drink, it made life seem almost intolerably sad for me, my 5 sisters, Etna, Monica, Gertie, Greta and Minnie, and my younger brother Nicholas. Coal shortages after the outbreak of the war saw my father emigrate to England to find work. He earned good money, sending back enough for my mother to make ends meet. My memory of those years is vague, but I was certainly conscious of the war because of the blackouts and the shortages of food, clothes and money. There was the anxious wait for letters from my father and relatives in England, so we would know we're all right. More immediate news was hard to come by because very few people on our road had a radio. On the day of a big match in Croke Park, if the weather was fine, people with radios would put them in their front parlour and open the window so that the neighbours could gather around and hear the commentary. We would generally go to our Aunt Molly McLean's to hear the match or a play, and my uncle John Geraghty used to call regularly and tell us of the latest broadcast from Berlin by Lord Haw Haw, the nickname for pro-German broadcaster William Joyce, who was hanged by the British after the war. There was always an air of seriousness when there was talk of the latest developments, because so many families had relatives in England or in the British forces. There always seemed to be a wan twilight in the houses at the time, probably because of the blackouts and fuel shortages. Our cooking was done on a Stanley range in the kitchen, and Mother did wonders with our rations. Our diet was supplemented by the odd sack of spuds, a chicken, or a few eggs that came from our grandfather and Colin. And every summer from when I was 7 until I was 14, I went to his house for a few weeks. The food, the freedom, security, along with the happy family atmosphere, it made it seem like paradise compared with home. After my father's return from England, once the war finished, he began selling turf. It was mainly winter work, as most people who bought from the bellman, so-called from the bell that hung around his horse's collar to announce his arrival, couldn't afford a fire from May to October, and carried out in appalling conditions of snow, rain and sleet. From 1947, his limp began to give him trouble, and he decided to invest in a motor truck that a friend said he could buy for £100. The idea was that the truck could be used for other business when the winter fuel season ended. He had to borrow the £100 from a loan company in Castle Street at an exorbitant interest, mortgaging our house as collateral. The truck never went right. It was old and in bad repair. He did get a few weeks' work hauling oranges from the docks when the first big shipment arrived after the war. Then the the truck just stopped. It took years to pay off the debt. I cried a lot in those days, and I was increasingly angry at my father's behaviour and the wrong he had done to our family. The worst aspect of his drunkenness and his treatment of us over the years was the fact that all the neighbours knew what was going on. For me, this was a terrible source of shame and embarrassment, affecting almost everything I did or thought. Our poverty also meant that neither my sisters nor I could consider staying on in school. Even before we left, we supplemented his meagre social welfare payments. He'd never paid social insurance contributions. By making a small handcart and buying loads of short pieces of wood from a local timber merchant, we chopped them into tin sticks at home and tied them into bundles for kindling. The load would cost about $1, and we'd get perhaps 120 to 140 bundles out of the load, which we would then load into our box car and sell door to door. We would all take a hand in the chopping and tying, but my sister Greta and I usually did the selling. We sold some to local people, but our main sales were on the Howth Road and in Marino, which were well-to-do areas by our standards, and were, I suspect, people who bought from us just as much out of sympathy as for the firewood. It was hard work, but we had no other way of making money until we left school. It was always a thrill when the last bundle was sold and we could head home on a Friday or Saturday night, cold but with 12 or 15 shillings to give to father, who'd handle the money. He would then hand some part of it over to the mother, so indirectly he felt like he was contributing. I don't wish to give the impression that my father was intrinsically cruel. He had a hard life, the final blow of which came in 1948, when he developed gangrene and had to have his leg amputated. He spent almost a year in hospital and a convalescent home. After that, his reduced mobility meant that he was no longer able to instill the same fear into us, and I think he suffered remorse. Although he never referred to it, it came through in other ways. From the time of his operation until he died, he was more like his real self. A man who was sensitive, loved music and literature, and was extraordinarily well read and informed on Irish history and international events. Needless to say, the experience of the truck, the way he was pursued by the loan company for repayments, and the amputation of his leg left him bitter about life and society. It was certainly a factor in his hatred for capitalism, landlords and loan sharks, as well as his gradual conversion to socialism. He was also a romantic, and some of that he no doubt passed on to me.